Good afternoon, everybody. It's my very, very great pleasure to have been asked about 3 minutes ago to introduce Lord Christopher Monckton to this group. This is going to be something very unusual for you. It's not very often that you find yourself in an entirely friendly environment. Some months ago, Christopher, on one of our Saturday morning sessions, told me that he was thinking of inviting Lord Monckton to give the Nuremberg lecture. And I immediately said to him, "Oh, Chris, please, can we at the same time try and arrange an International Free Press Society Canada event with him?" And after many tractations over a long period of time, I'm really, really happy to welcome you all to hear Lord Monckton speak. Many of you have seen his videos, and none of us who've met him have been disappointed. And I'd just like to tell you a small anecdote. I think it was, when was it? I guess it was 2008 or 2007. Lord Monckton wrote a piece which he sent to John McCain, and I think pleading with him to please abandon the global warming train and the disastrous economic and other policies that would follow from it. And I read this in the American Thinker and pressed the reply button and sent a little message to him saying, "Why don't you send this to the British members of Parliament? They seem to need it even more than the Americans do." To which, I hope you won't mind me recounting this, he wrote back and said, "They can't read." And on this note, I will ask you to come and speak.
My lords, that's me, ladies and gentlemen, after that amazingly disconcerting but unduly flattering introduction, I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. A prostitute, a politician, and an engineer were in a bar together discussing which of theirs was the oldest profession. The prostitute said that hers was known to be. The engineer said that God created order out of chaos, and that was an engineering feat. And the politician, wearing a Viscount's coronet and an old Harrovian tie, said, "And who do you think it was that made the chaos?" So I'm now here to introduce a note of chaos into these proceedings by suggesting that just because we are told there is a consensus about stuff doesn't mean there is one. And if you go back 2,300 years, you're all too young to remember, but at that time, Aristotle first wrote down the dozen commonest fallacies in human discourse, logical fallacies. And not the least among these was that fallacy which the medieval schoolmen would later characterize as the argumentum ad populum, the head count fallacy. You can't determine whether or not a proposition is true at all merely because a lot of people are said to believe that it is true. Whether or not there's a consensus about something tells you nothing about whether or not it's true. And yet today, we are told by the environmentalists, they used to call themselves Marxists, but it sounds so much cuddlier to be environmentalists, that just as they were so certain of their ghastly political system before, so they're now certain of exactly the same ghastly political system now. It's been rebranded and tidied up for the 21st century, but it's the same brand, insisting that only it knows what is best for us, and that it is our duty to knuckle under and obey what they call the consensus and which we would call the party line. Now, if you look, for instance, at what is about to happen, which is the Agenda 21 conference at Rio de Janeiro on the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit, which launched the whole ghastly process of the global warming scare and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now they're having a big self-congratulatory jamboree, as usual, down in a nice exotic location with beaches and dancing girls and grass skirts and all the other accoutrements that no scientist these days can be seen without. There they will be, and they will be deciding, as they have been trying to decide for the last 20 years, that what we need to do is to shut down the West. That's how you can tell that this is essentially the communist agenda all over again. The communists of old would always start by trying to attack the soft underbelly of the West, which is, of course, our energy supply. They organised the Miners' Trade Union in the United Kingdom. They trained Arthur Scargill first at the Patrice Lumumba University of Terrorism in Moscow, and then when they realised he was a cut above the rest, transferred him to the Lenin Institute, where the top terrorists from all around the world, the Yasser Arafat, the Jerry Adamses, they were all trained there. And then he came back to the UK and began making trouble. It was they who founded, funded and animated the campaign for nuclear disarmament, which was nothing to do with nuclear weapons really. It was to try and turn us off the idea of developing the peaceful uses of nuclear power. So that with the unions having prevented us to using our coal for fossil fuel, they would then also shut down the possibility of developing nuclear power, and we would simply run out of energy and be reduced to exactly the same collapsed economic state which they had so gloriously already achieved. Now this battle, even though the Soviet communism has now gone, and good riddance, is still being fought by those whom they planted in the West to fight it. Nobody seems to have told them that, hello, communism has gone. You now have the same type of people using the same type of rhetoric, but no longer carrying the baggage of the failed Soviet system. Now, under its rebranding, they're saying we need to pursue what the UN in its Agenda 21 document calls the sustainability agenda. And this new buzzword, sustainability, means you can't do anything if something might run out when you do it. That's it in a nutshell. Now, since we live on a planet from which few of us will have any chance permanently of escaping, because the well of gravity is still too deep for us to claw our way out with any facility, we are dealing with resources, all of which are to some degree or another finite. Everything is running out, including sunlight. This just in 4.5 billion years, the sun will burn itself out. So no more sunbathing, because you're running us out of sunlight. And they say that we're going to experience peak oil, peak fossil fuels, and everything from there on will be downhill. The fact that this is not true, and will not be true for hundreds or even thousands of years, does not matter. The fact is, we have to fossilize everything, because if they hate fossil fuels so much, this idea of fossilizing everything in its place is very strange, but that's what they want. They want no change. They are, in fact, the new conservatives. They want everything to be as it has always been. Go back to those lovely pictures of rustic Europe painted by the great Dutch masters, with men toiling up and down the fields with pitchforks and building haystacks and harvesting by hand, and it's all a very nice rural myth. But just imagine how many people would have to die in order to bring about that myth of sustainable development. And let's start with the number of people who are dying already because of the myth of sustainable development. If we go back this time to within the lifetime of some of us, the 1960s, when the ban on DDT came in. This was done in the name of sustainability. preserving the environment from the terrible wanton destruction that the release of DDT therein would inevitably cause. Now, of course, this was based, as all these scares are, on bogus science, but they succeeded in the left capturing this issue. They shut down all use of DDT worldwide, and DDT, at the point when they did this, was just about to eradicate malaria altogether. Malaria was on its way out everywhere. Deaths worldwide had fallen to 50,000 a year. Bad enough, goodness knows, but a lot less bad than they had been when, for instance, most of North America was malarial in the 19th century. It isn't now because DDT was widely used and eradicated it. That could and should and would have happened everywhere else in the world had it not been for one book by one well-meaning but dopey scientist who got her science wrong, Rachel Carson. And she wrote The Silent Spring. And notice this was not a scientific title, published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was an emotive title. And here began the process of emotionalizing and making cuddly the killing of tens of millions of people. No longer would you have the jackbooted Nazis walking across the landscape as the Jews were slaughtered. Now you would have children slaughtered, a massacre of the innocents, the like of which has never been seen. But this would somehow be all right, because even if the children were dying, they were dying in the good cause of saving the planet. And what happened? From 50,000 deaths by malaria before the ban came in, within 5 years, the deaths from malaria had rocketed again to 1 million a year. And they have stayed at somewhere around 1 million a year ever since. In fact, last year, 1.25 million deaths. And yet, on September the 15th, 2006, Dr. Arata Kochi, the head of the UN's malaria program, announced that he would lift the malaria ban, the DDT ban. He said, in this field, science usually comes second and politics first. We will now take a stand on the science and the data. And he lifted the ban on DDT and announced that in future it would be once again the front line of defense against the mosquito. And what happened? Nothing happened. Children are the ones that malaria kills, so they continue to die, 1 million plus every year, because the left want them to. Because the left, for all the talk of caring, do not care about the little ones of our own species. And so there is your first clue as to what this sustainability agenda is all about. It is a ruthless depopulation agenda. The view is that there are too many of us on the planet, and that unless something is done, there will be too many more. All our fellow species will one by one be wiped out, and this would be bad news. So what is the truth? The truth which you will not hear spoken at Rio. The truth is quite different, as any demographer will tell you. If you have a population that is poor, it will tend to breed faster than a population that is rich. So if you keep a population poor, or by various policies, including those intended to improve so-called sustainability, you make a rich population poorer again, then you will increase the birth rate. If, on the other hand, you want to stabilize the birth rate of humankind, particularly in the poorer countries where the birth rate is greatest, there is one reliable as well as manifestly humane way to do it, and that is to raise the standard of living of the poorest so that it comes up above the poverty line. And in every nation where this has been achieved, regardless of the availability or non-availability of contraception or baby butchering or all the other devices for interfering in nature's way. The population has tended towards mere replacement rate rather than rampant growth. And so the problem that I have, the central problem with the Agenda 21 proposal, as it is put forward by the UN, in the documents which are now being treated by the totalitarian left as their new gospel, is that these documents would make the whole world poorer and would therefore paradoxically achieve precisely the opposite of the intended depopulation effect by bringing about an increase in the population of the very poorest and, of course, of humanity as a whole. So it's not just that the message of Agenda 21 is politically undesirable and prescriptive and dirigiste and centraliste and étatiste in the extreme. Funny how the French have all the words for this kind of thing. It is also, at the economic level, completely wrong-headed. What it will do is increase the human population, increase human misery considerably, and achieve precisely the opposite of whatever genuinely pious effect may have been intended, and that's a big stretch to assume that they did intend a pious effect, but let's pretend. It will simply vitiate any such pious intent by causing this huge increase in population. So how have we come to this pass? Go back to Imperial China. And early Imperial China first defined and meditated upon the fundamental divide in the politics of the world, which is a divide between what the Chinese called the legalists, we would call them totalitarians, socialists, national socialists, international socialists, communists, Marxists, fascists, they're all the same. The people who know better than we do how our lives should be run and wish to prescribe it down to the very last detail by force if necessary, including what kind of light bulb you can use. On the one hand, the legalists, and on the other, what the Chinese called the Confucians. Now, anyone who has read the Analects of Confucius cannot but be impressed by the generosity of spirit that the great philosopher of ancient China displayed. And he was, you can see this in the way he meditates upon what is virtue and what isn't. He was a libertarian. He was a live and let live kind of guy. Don't interfere unless you really have to. Leave it to people to work it out for themselves. That was his philosophy. And they called that the Confucian philosophy. We would call it the free market philosophy. Freedom-loving, democracy-loving, liberty-loving. The conservative philosophy, if you like. That is the central divide. And what is happening now is that the extreme legalists, or the extreme left, or whatever label you want to put, they have grown tired of democracy. It was once seen by some of them as a good thing. Now they see it as poison, because what it does is to give the individual the right to choose for himself what government he shall have, what laws shall be imposed upon him, and what taxes he shall endure. And they want to do that for us. So they don't want that liberty to exist any longer. And they want to take democracy away. They've already done it in Europe by setting up the European Union and with annual treaties transferring more and more power away from elected hands to unelected hands. And whatever other benefits may come of this, the loss of democracy in Europe is now near total. And it is European advisors who are telling the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change how to use exactly the same techniques of annual agreements. They can't call them treaties because the US Senate, thank goodness, went past them, so as to transfer power inexorably away from free nations such as Canada towards the new centralist dictatorship, worldwide this time, with no chance of competition or extinction, that they wish to create. And you may say, as members of the International Free Press Society, what has the press to say about this? Well, let me quote what they say about this. They have nothing to say. They are near totally, culpably silent. Give you one little vignette to illustrate just how near unanimously silent they are when confronted with this growing power grab by the legalist classe politique to take power from the ordinary yous and me's of the world. In Durban last December, there was the latest of the annual UN Climate Gab Fests, at which, just like all the previous ones, a written agreement was produced, transferring yet more power from the hands of elected countries where they have them to the unelected central regime. And among the provisions in this exciting document of several hundred turgid pages of UN bureaucraties, described by the UN's former head of the documentation centre as transparent impenetrability, they said that they were going to set up an international climate court to which only Western countries could be dragged because they hadn't paid enough Danegeld to the UN Framework Convention, which effectively would become the new world government. Only Western countries could be hauled before this international climate court, and of course troublemakers like Monckton, who say there isn't that much of a problem with the climate, and even if there was, it would be cheaper to do nothing about it. They were also going to give rights of legal personality to Mother Earth. Mother Earth, God bless her, if you go to Tibet and you go to the largest mountain overlooking Tibet, its name in Tibetan is Tsumulangma. This means Goddess Mother Earth. Well, hey, those people in Tibet might like to know the Goddess Mother Earth now has rights of legal personality. She can sue. And this is very much part of the theme of the Agenda 21, which is that we must give rights to the birds and the trees. And they must now be able to sue in the person of any busybody who wants to intervene and say that any capitalist enterprise that wishes to cut down a tree or build a factory is harming the planet and must be stopped and hauled before the International Climate Court. So that was another of the ludicrous proposals. And just one more I'll mention, and that is that the carbon dioxide concentration of the planet, now approaching 400 parts per million by volume on average. It's probably about 1100 in here just at the moment, because I'm talking rather a lot and emitting a fair amount. They were going to cut that from 400 to 200 parts per million by volume. And the effect of that reduction would have been to reduce the net primary productivity of plants and trees so very greatly, because CO2 is their food, that many species would have died out altogether, all would have become less productive, and mass starvation, not only of humans, but of animals feeding upon these plants and trees, would inevitably result. But that was one of the options actually listed for serious discussion in this draft conclusions of the conference. Now, how many of you have heard any of those provisions mentioned in any mainstream news medium that you have seen?
No.
And there is the test, not a hand goes up. Because these provisions, which were in the document, were not mentioned, as far as I could discover, by any news medium whatsoever. They were all there at Durban, not one mentioned the whole purpose of this conference, which was to decide upon this particular document. So, I got into the conference. I was a registered delegate. They tried to keep me out even so. So I hired a plane and parachuted in. And then they couldn't keep me out. And I got hold of this document and got out before they could stop me, and went straight to put it up on the web. And 2 days later, WordPress, that runs the blogs all around the world and posts up 500,000 blog postings every day, got in touch, and they said, we get in touch every day with the one person who has received more hits to his blog posting than any of the others we've posted that day. And number one that day was Monckton just telling people what was in the negotiating document. Now, I'm not telling this story to say, how clever am I? Well, yes, I am, but I'm also telling the story to say, why did no newspaper or other medium utter a word of this until I had, and even then virtually none of them did? It is because the newspapers themselves have largely been taken over by a narrow political faction, the legalists again, and they would regard it as contrary to their political views to allow the truth of this matter, or of any matter related to it, such as we're not getting the amount of warming the IPCC predicted, etc., etc., ever to be mentioned where a large number of readers could ever hope to see it. Now, as Albert Camus said, a free press may be either good or bad, but without freedom, it cannot be anything but bad. Now, my question is this: we can't regulate the press, but we can perhaps compete with this near universal Marxism among the newspapers. Fox News in the United States has just posted its annual profits. They made $2 million a day. How did they do it? From a standing start 17 years ago, they now have more than half the news audience of the United States. All the various Marxist channels, there are 14 or 15 of them, are having to compete for the rest of the advertising revenue. So I don't think we need to regulate the press, because that will take away any hope of freedom and will make them every bit as bad as Camus was suggesting. But I do think that certainly here in Canada you've begun this with some media beginning to compete. In Australia and in the United Kingdom we're working now on plans to do the same. We will compete with these people. We will provide the alternative message of peace and freedom and prosperity and hope. We will not be stopped, and we will simply defeat them in the old-fashioned way by competing with them commercially. Thank you.
I'm not sure how we do the time. Okay, so we have to leave shortly, but we can maybe take a couple of questions.
Sure, yeah.
If anybody has a question.
Is global warming a little piece of Agenda 21 or how does this fit in?
It's all part of the same nexus. Global warming is the one they had hoped would be the mainspring that would achieve it all for them. Then the likes of me came along and said, excuse me, but the emperor has no clothes. This doesn't add up. And they found that it only took a few of us to bring the whole bandwagon to a halt. So they all jumped onto the sustainability bandwagon, into which they will subsume the global warming thing and it will gradually fade away. And so it's all part of the same process. They just need always an excuse to shut down the West,
Yes.
to reduce us back to the level of primitive savagery. And why don't I like this? The main reason, I think, is that they're attacking the use of reason itself. Anyone who reads the attacks on me will think two things. One, what a rotter he is, and in that they might not be so far wrong. But they would also perhaps feel that the scientific attacks on me are staggering by their intellectual dishonesty. And this is a curious feature because they don't want the use of reason to prevail. If people can think for themselves, they'll start wanting to vote for themselves. So if you can stop them thinking for themselves, then the battle for dictatorship is essentially won. Now, the use of reason is one of the three great powers of the soul in Christian thought, along with the memory and the will. And the use of reason is the central power in Christian theology. And it is in our soul, which is composed of these three powers, the memory, the understanding, and the will, that our distance from the rest of the visible creation is most clearly visible. That's what makes us human, if you like. But that's also what makes us design, because in that our closeness to our Creator is made most visible. And that is what Agenda 21 and all the related movements such as global warming want to take away. They want us to stop thinking and stop reasoning. And I'm against that.
Lord Monckton, is there not also a profit motive on the part of a number of these people that are promoting this?
Yes.
Could you illustrate some that you might think are ready with the professed?
Certainly. How can you too make money out of global warming? Well, the first thing is you can set up yourself as a Vice President of the United States and then retire. And then you can make a bad sci-fi comedy horror movie and hawk it round the schools until the High Court comes along in London and says, hang on a moment, there are rather a number of serious errors in this movie, and we're going to ban the film unless 77 pages of corrective guidance are sent round. And then you don't make so much money after that. Or you can be a duke, or even a viscount, provided you have land on which somebody can build windmills. You can take a share of the revenue from the windmills they put on your land. These will be subsidised by taxpayers generally. So, just as should always be the case, the poor should subsidise the aristocracy via their taxes. I'm only joking, by the way, but I just but then what is another way to make money? Of course, you can be a windmill manufacturer, make a fortune out of that, or a solar panel manufacturer, or like Professor Tim Flannery of Australia, who is now their chief climate commissioner. He had a wonderful boondoggle a few years ago to try and dig down through the earth, pump water in through one hole, back up through the other, and the earth being hotter down below than up here, it would come up as steam and you could drive a turbine and get lots of electricity. It's called geothermal power. Well, they tried this with $1.5 million, I think it was, of taxpayers' money, and the thing blew up and blew the entire taxpayer investment. And Flannery's reward for this noble effort of throwing away $1.5 million of taxpayers' money was to become the chief climate commissioner of Australia. Doesn't matter how wrong you get this, as long as you make the right noises. Or you can be a bureaucrat or a politician. And they depend for their income and their salaries and their pensions and their mansions and all the other luxuries and private jets that go with politics these days on the generosity of the taxpayer. So if you can invent a boondoggle like global warming, which allows you vastly to increase your regulatory powers and your taxation scales, then you do what the civil service in Britain calls increasing the tax base. And every time they say that, they slaver as they see their empires expanding and the revenues increasing. So the bureaucratic class makes money. And the media make money out of it also, because, hey, if I run a story saying climate continuing changeable, that would be true, but unexciting, and I wouldn't sell many papers that way. But supposing I said, planet doomed sensation, pictures, pages 4 to 37, I'm going to sell shed loads of papers and make lots of money. So which side is the press going to be on in this story? Always the side of the alarmists, and they're going to make a lot of money out of it until the truth begins to dawn. And the very fact that Agenda 21 has now been set up and started running shows that they've all realised that the global warming boondoggle, bandwagon and gravy train are all about to tip into the gulch, and they need to find some other way of trying to extract vast amounts of additional taxpayers' money from us. Well, they failed with global warming, they will fail with Agenda 21. So,
I'd like to preface what I say.
No, please, the whole question.
I'm sorry?
Just a question, please.
Okay. How will we know if and when we have global warming? We've had global warming since the Ice Age of the glaciers have been melting.
Very good question.
How will we know if we're contributing in a significant fashion? How much of a planet do we have to burn for it to heat up? And how fast do we have to do it?
Right, very good. How much global warming will we get, and how will we tell whether that's us or something else? The fact is that until thousands of years have passed, we won't know, if you believe the official analysis of the IPCC, because they say that the global warming we trigger now will not be complete for 3,000 years. So not all of it will happen within our lifetimes anyway. But then it's very difficult to distinguish, in fact it's impossible in the state of science now, to distinguish between warming caused by a natural recovery from the Little Ice Age. That recovery began in 1695. Madam, even you are too young to remember that. And so 1695, and it's been going on at various rates ever since. How can we tell whether that natural recovery of temperatures has stopped and we're now getting something additional caused by us? Well, one possible metric might be to say, was there a medieval warm period? And was it warmer than today? Well, something like 1,200 scientists from more than 600 institutions in 44 countries have contributed to papers over the last 25 years, providing evidence from the paleoclimate record, from everything from sediments to stalagmites to ice cores to boreholes and various other ways, that the medieval warm period was real, was global, and was warmer than the present. If they are right, then today's temperatures are not exceptional, in which case it's very hard to say that at the moment we can discern any human influence on global climate at all. And that was the original conclusion of the 1995 IPCC report, as submitted by the scientists. For the second time they said we can't actually distinguish a human signature at all. Now the bureaucrats took one look at this. We can't have this. This is unacceptable. They'll close us down if we're saying for the second time that we're not having any influence on the climate. So they got one scientist to rewrite it. And all 5 references to the statement that we couldn't discern a human influence on global climate were taken out. 200 consequential amendments were also made, and a single new statement was inserted which says it is now clear that there is a discernible human influence on global climate, the precise opposite of what the scientists who had written and submitted the final document had said. So the answer is that science is with us in saying you can't tell the difference between anthropogenic and natural warming, and one of the reasons why you can't is the anthropogenic warming is small enough that certainly over the last 10 or 15 years there hasn't been any global warming in total at all, because presumably there is some natural factor such as a decline in the activity of the sun which is now countervailing against the comparatively gentle upward pressure on temperatures which our addition of CO2 will cause. Bottom line, there is no problem with the climate. Even if there were, it would be cheaper and more cost effective by hundreds of times over to do nothing about it than to pursue the present mad policies to try to forestall it. And therefore the best policy to address the non-problem of the climate is to have the courage to do nothing. Ma'am.
I find it entertaining that we've had such monumental changes in climate, like the Carboniferous, before there were ever people on the earth. All this happened without people.
Now, Madam, she's harking back there to the Carboniferous, which she remembers well, and reminding us that temperatures then were quite a bit higher than they are now. And in fact, for most of the last 750 million years, and she will join me in agreeing with this, there has been temperature, most of the time, has been around 8 Celsius warmer than it is today. At no time has it been much below 8 Celsius colder than it is today. And we are around about in the middle. So we haven't seen much of a variation in temperature up or down from that central line over the last 750 million years, despite the enormous influences of changes in the sun, intergalactic dust, impacts of meteors and comets, huge supervolcano eruptions, and changes in the eccentricity, obliquity, and nutation of the Earth. All of these things have exercised over the millennia major influences which have only resulted in extraordinarily small changes in temperature. In absolute terms, less than 3% up or down from what we infer was the mean temperature over the last 750 million years, which is roughly the temperature which we enjoy today. So the idea that by altering the composition of the atmosphere by 1 part in 2,000, converting it from oxygen to carbon dioxide over the next 100 years, we are suddenly going to fling the Earth into some new and strange state that it's never seen before, is plainly barking nonsense. Thank you for your question. Sir?
Could you comment on the issue of Islamization in Europe and the demographic implications that there may be?
Certainly. In Russia, this year, the number of Muslims, for the first time, outnumbered all others in the population.
Really? The number of?
Muslims. And this is also about to happen in France, probably in 10 or 15 years. It will happen in Britain within 30 years. And we can't tell exactly because the rate of immigration from Islamic countries is so very high, and the birth rate from the Islamists, of course, is much higher than ours for 2 reasons. One, because they are now breeding deliberately, using what is called the power of the womb to outnumber us. And 2, because we practice the extraordinarily vile habit of murdering our children in the womb, not even giving them an anesthetic before we tear them limb from limb piecemeal. And if by some mischance they are born alive, they are left to gasp their fluttering last on some cold hospital draining board under the cold glare of the strip lights and the still colder glare of their butchers. We are killing the West in the most direct way possible by killing very large numbers of our children. And this shameful practice is one which is not followed in Islam. They don't do it. They don't believe in it. And in that one overriding respect, and I'll explain why I say overriding in a moment, in that one overriding respect, they are morally superior to us in the West. In many other respects, they are inferior morally. But in that respect, they are morally superior, and they know it. And it is that knowledge of an overriding moral superiority that we kill our children in the womb and they don't, that leads them to exploit this moral difference to the point of increasing their numbers in our countries by as much immigration as they can get away with and as much breeding as they can get away with. And as many of you may yet not be too old to remember, breeding is fun. So they are taking possession of the world as we are throwing away the West. We're throwing away our future because we are throwing away our children and putting the bits into the hospital incinerator. And until we learn to stop doing that, 2 consequences will follow. One, there's no point in our worrying about the progressive Islamization of our societies, because it will happen with ever-increasing rapidity. And 2, we had better not think that we're morally superior, because we're not.